Welcome to the Reclaim the Night Perth podcast, hosted by Sarah, Liz and Ava. Links to resources relating to the topics we discuss are in the description. We hope you enjoy! The Australian Government Department of Social Services has recently released a Commonwealth consent policy framework to promote healthy sexual relationships and consent among young people. And the three of us have read through it, and we have thoughts and comments and just things to bring up about the framework. But first I want to talk about what it actually is, just to give the audience an idea. The framework is to promote healthy sexual relationships and consent, particularly among young people. So it's mainly about sexual violence prevention, so addressing the needs of specifically young people, supporting a cultural shift in community attitudes, promoting respectful sexual behaviour and relationships, and ultimately aiming to prevent violence. It also aims to address the issues of sexist attitudes, particularly among young people. And there's two sections to it, and section 1 explains concepts, while section 2 explores how it can be put into practice. And it seems like the framework itself is aimed towards people who will implement it in like an educational setting. So that could be like community leaders, but also like teachers, education programs, things like that. Yeah, it challenges the idea that consent is a problem to be solved or a transaction of given or received. And it also defines core concepts of sexual consent. So sexual consent should be free and voluntary, specific and informed, affirmative and communicated, ongoing and mutual, and reflect capacity.
I just say, I really like the framing, right? Because the thing that this does that I think has been missing in previous consent frameworks is that it says there is a problem, and the framework actually has some stats in it, which I think is so critical. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced sexual violence since 15. 1 in 2 women in their 20s have experienced sexual violence. I mean, this locates this as a huge problem up front, and that has to be critical in developing a framework that is going to address the normal feminist critiques of this kind of framework. So anyway, I'm really excited. They also note that there are marginalization factors. Oh my God, for want of a better word, being First Nations, women with disability, LGBT, etc. I think class is also poverty. There are also some other factors, but I love up front that it's really explicit. I think stats also show that a lot of sexual violence peaks, for young women. That's not to say that older women don't experience sexual violence, because I wish that were the case. I wish it stopped. I mean, I wish it never happened, but we know that there is a peak period where it's actually worse. You have young girls, you have childhood sexual assault, and then you have younger adolescents and young women, and it's a particularly bad time for women in their lives. So I think aiming it at what we know to be such a problematic time is excellent. We also should note, just on that it isn't necessarily young men doing the sexual violence. Stats are not consistently showing that young women are being assaulted by their peers. There is a fairly horrifying preponderance of childhood and adolescent and young women's sexual violence that is inflicted on them by properly adult men, which is disgusting. But it's noteworthy that it's not just peer-to-peer.
I think some wonderful things about the framework when it goes into what is the problem to be addressed by explaining like what sexual violence is and things like that. So it considers it to be, but not limited to, it says includes but not limited to sexual assault, rape, sexual harassment, stalking, and image-based abuse. I think the latter is really important to include, particularly when they're talking about youth experiences. I think this is an ongoing issue, and I think it's just going to get worse and worse and worse with things like AI, but also just that there is this belief that among young men in particular that sharing sexual images is totally fine among their peers. And then it also says that it occurs most commonly within family and intimate partner relationships, so it's not perpetuating the idea that stranger danger and things like that. Excellent. But also not saying it doesn't happen. It just says most commonly. And recognises that it is a form of gender-based violence, most commonly perpetrated by men. So yeah, I think there's some really good foundational things here that recognize the reality of what's going on rather than ignoring it to promote a much simpler, maybe easier idea. So I'm just going to read also what it defines consent as. So it says, not only is consent the baseline for sexual activity free of violence and coercion, it is also fundamental to healthy, pleasurable sexual activity within or outside of relationships. Healthy sexual relationships are inclusive of all sexual orientations and genders and founded on characteristics like trust, empathy, effective communication, equality, safety, and respect. And then it creates like a specific definition of consent as a free, voluntary, and informed agreement between people to participate in a sexual act. This agreement is only present when these people mutually and genuinely want to engage in that sexual act and actively ensure their partner does too. So I think there's a lot of good stuff in there that it's not overly simplistic, right? It's not going to cause an oversimplification of consent in the way that we've had problems in the past or currently with how we talk about consent and stuff like that. If there's ways to pull apart definitions, and I think they've tried quite hard to make sure that this can't really be pulled apart.
Yeah, I really like this definition a lot and was pleasantly surprised by it because I personally have complicated views on the concept of consent. And I think to some extent, actually, it was maybe a bit of a mistake to frame conversations about sexual violence and male sexual violence against women in those terms, because it, like you alluded to, Ava, set up a situation where consent is seen as something to be one, that, if you can get a woman to agree to sex, then you've got the go ahead. And whether or not the woman has complicated reasons for assenting to sex, whether or not the woman actively desires the sex is actually kind of not a part of that conversation, which is a problem. So I like this definition because it talks about genuine mutual desire for the sexual act to take place, and putting emphasis on that is really important because I wouldn't even talk about this in terms of consent. Actually, I'd say that definition, that's just describing the preconditions for sex that is not harmful to someone, because any sex that happens outside of the context of mutual genuine desire for that sex is harmful. I really, really like the fact that that's been emphasized in this way in the policy. It made me do a little double take, actually, because I didn't expect it.
Yeah, I also think the last line or the last little section of like actively ensuring their partner does too is it ensures that it's like a two-way thing, but also it ensures that it's an ongoing throughout the experience thing. Because there is issues with women agreeing to sex that they genuinely want, but then the sex that they want is not what is actually happening in the experience, and so they then want to stop the experience, but their partner thinks, well, they said yes at the beginning, so that's okay, I can keep doing whatever I'm doing.
Yeah, like they want that, they wanted sex, broadly speaking, but sex is very broad and is made up of a bunch of different specific things. And of course, really, this should always be coming back to, is this something that this person genuinely wants? Is there real desire? Are they having a good time? And are they comfortable with it? So, bringing focus back onto that, I think, goes a long way to kind of squashing all of the talking points, the excuses that, this person didn't say no, or so on and so forth. Because, I mean, the question really is like, do you want to subject someone to unwanted sex? Like, because that hurts
well, a whole
people,
bunch
right?
of men might say yes, actually.
Well, that's
I mean,
part of the problem, and I think we should get to that.
There's some pretty controversial things that come up in studies. Is this a good segue into feminist critiques of consent frameworks? Consent frameworks have been in the development for some time, and there's been quite a lot of feminist critique of some of them. But yeah, that, as you've said, there are some really big issues here around choice, coercion, socialization, women's experiences that go into that lead into that sexual experience, how women respond as a result of their experiences, socialization, cultural context. Basically the context in which we operate is still a male supremacist world. Women are framed really particularly, and, consent frames need to take that into account. I mean, it sounds like this one might have done a much better job of it than previous ones have. I guess maybe it is a good idea to start with the world we live in, which is what the framework does. We are totally framed. We live in a world where female socialization and coercion is part of it, is part of women's experience. It's their formative frame. And it's worth noting that male violence and female economic dependence is part of that frame that coerces women into certain behaviors. There were some interesting stats just adding to what the framework has. There was an ANROS study in 2019, and that's the Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, and that showed that 1 in 7 young Australians said rape was justified if a woman changes her mind. 1 in 4 thought that it was flattering to be pursued even if you didn't want to be, which is really relevant in the context of persistent unwanted attention. That's really still flattering. There was a different 2017 study that showed that 1/3 of people surveyed thought rape was about men not being able to control themselves. And in that study, 12% didn't understand that rape in a marriage was illegal. They thought that if you wanted sex, you could just go on and take it, which is, horrifying frame. And it speaks to that kind of active man, passive woman. And the ANROS study again, 1/3 of young men surveyed thought that rape victims had actually just led a man on and regretted it.
34% believed it is common for sexual assault accusations to be used as a way of getting back at men, despite the evidence.
Oh my God, can I just say that one always does my head in, because when you look at the stats, if you take 100 rapes that are reported, and we know they're underreported, but if you take 100 rapes that are reported, less than one of those will result in a jail time and a guilty verdict and jail time, despite the fact that rape is one of the most under false reported crimes. It's got the lowest false report rate, and it just is absolutely infuriating that anyone thinks that men are actually punished for rape. That is a sanctioned crime.
I would just interject there actually as well, because that's absolutely correct. I think that possibly a counter to that would be that, well, the men still suffer the reputational damage and there is no protection from that. There's nothing to stop that. It doesn't matter if they're not convicted. However, arguably, I think a lot of the time the bulk of the reputational damage from making a rape accusation is actually borne by the woman who makes it, even when people believe her. Because when people believe the accusation, there will be a million reasons why they don't want to be seen to believe her. They don't want to be seen to support her. They don't want to be implicated in any way in what's happening. So even where the woman is seen as credible, she is probably going to be suffering more. She's more likely to become persona non grata within her community and circles than the man she's accusing. So it's just nonsense. Like, it's not beneficial to women, even vindictive women, actually.
Very few men are actually punished, even, as you say, the ones we know that did it. I don't actually think that they face much social opprobrium. We know they don't face much legal punishment. There is not much in the way of a social lever there. There is the odd big public rape case where a man is, maybe sort of dismantled, maybe, so I will grant there's the odd one where a man is actually held to account, but they're not representative of what is happening, and they're so unusual.
And it also doesn't take into account the psychological damage that also occurs from a woman deciding to make her case public. Whether or not it results in the accused man facing any consequences for that, a lot of the time, as we've talked about, he doesn't, and he may do temporarily. So maybe for the first couple of years after, he is persona non grata, but after that, he's fine. He'll still get jobs, he'll still get work, he'll still have his social circle. He won't suffer the same kind of psychological pain that the woman will experience for publicly talking about it, and that being the thing that they are known for the rest of their lives. Even if they've already had a very public-facing career or whatever, social life or whatever, they will always be known with that.
Yes.
And they'll have to deal with jokes being made about them publicly as well.
Absolutely. So we see, and we've seen around the world judges going, oh, but we don't want to punish the promising young man But yeah, the women are the ones who live with it. Women often talk about, when you hear women who've gone through these cases, they often talk about the way it was re-traumatizing. So yeah, the idea that that this is a lever for vindictive women is delusional. I mean, it is not correct. It's also worth noting that all of those stats are based on our traditional sex role stereotypes, right?
Mhm.
So it's about, the existing socialization of women to be good mothers, wives, good performing sexual partners, to be caregivers, including sexually. The advent of rampant porn culture has not helped that, because they're meant to give the porn star experience, never mind what their experience is, because the porn star experience is not fun for women, as even porn stars will say. What women want is totally secondary at best. I mean, there has been decades of work, and I think what we see now is perhaps a different set of attitudes to some extent than you saw 50 years ago, but I don't think that that makes it a safe sexual environment for women. But also, like, to talk back to the coercion point, women are earning less. They're often dependent on men financially, particularly if they're mothers, and then they can be in an abusive or toxic relationship and managing really difficult dynamics. All of this means that women are acting from a position of inequality and a power imbalance, both at an individual level, in their individual relationship, and also as a class, as a sex class, and the men and women involved might not even understand this, particularly if we're talking about young people. In that context, where you've got significant proportions of women being sexually assaulted, raped, sexually harassed, including, with the particularly high rates of young people, the question is, does the consent model that we've got here allow us to enunciate women's experience of sexual harm? Does it take into account the freeze response? So there was an ACT study done, oh my God, sometime in the last 10 years. I'm sorry, I can't remember more specifically than that, maybe 2014-ish. I think they entered the freeze response into the understanding, but they did a survey from the 70s to that point. And over those 4 decades, they discovered that the freeze response was present in 50% of the cases that had been addressed. So we've got to really understand that that is a critical part of it. We also normatively don't say blunt no's. Would you like a cup of tea? God, no. No, you don't say that. Often we say, would you like a cup of tea? I mean, sorry to use the tea analogy. I know that might be the most trite way to deal with it. But, we often don't say, no, I don't want tea. We often say, oh, I've just had a glass of water, or, oh, I might have a such and such later. Or we socially don't often do blunt no's. And I don't know why we would think that in the most fraught, complicated part of our lives, we're going to suddenly magically be good at it. And I guess there's a question about whether this frame relies on a no, or is it really is it affirmative? Is it affirmative enough? The trauma-based choices, what are women socialized explicitly by our framing into, and what does their trauma, their experiences teach them about the world and how things will be taken? What if the guy knows she doesn't want to do it and he pesters her? I mean, we are all familiar with the, oh, come on, come on, come on. If she says yes at that point, is it a meaningful consent? So how does this frame deal with some of those questions? What are your thoughts on whether this is a better model?
To address your first point, this is one of the surprisingly positive things about it, in my opinion, is that it mentions the freeze. It talks about, not saying no or freezing or silence are not, or appearing disengaged. Any apparent discomfort, hesitation, or resistance doesn't imply consent. And it does, in multiple places, once again, re-emphasize the importance of actual desire. Like, it's not just that's not consent, but that doesn't mean the person wants it. So, and I think recentering that is a really, really crucial thing, and the thing that makes me really like this policy, actually, because all of these, the sort of analytical way that we will talk about the issue of male sexual violence against women, and we will talk about things like, entitlement, for example, and we will talk about the ways in which maybe young men end up getting the wrong messages about things, and all of that. But fundamentally, and all that stuff is relevant, but fundamentally, in my opinion, the main issue is a lack of compassion for women. That's it. Like that women, that empathy and compassion is not extended to women enough to not want to subject them to the damage that unwanted sexual activity causes to a person. We know that this does this to people. I don't want to do that to someone. So why are there a bunch of men who want to do it, and a bunch of men who are quite happy to do it while denying that they know that's what they were doing? Like it's because women are not
here, right?
Yeah, so I was going to get to the porn thing as well, since you raised it. Probably the only like criticism that I have of this policy, and it's not even so much a criticism as it is just a bit of an observation, is that it does mention porn, but it touches on it very, very briefly. It makes reference to porn maybe giving young people the wrong idea and them needing to understand that porn shouldn't be seen as instructional. And it also doesn't make any reference in any place about the rest of the sex trade. And it one of the other documents that it references is the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, which is the more recent one, 2022 to 2032. And that does have a little section on what it refers to as sex work as well. And it quite rightly talks about how obviously being engaged in the sex trade is another complicating factor for women when it comes to sexual violence because of issues with like reporting it and stuff like that. But I do think that it's a bit inconsistent that in the way it defines consent, it is talking about it not being transactional. It is talking about mutual genuine desire being a precondition for it. But in the sex trade, whether it is pornographic performance or prostitution itself, which is literally transactional sex, those two things are not compatible. That it's so, and I get it, because that's complicated, and that's not something that can necessarily be kind of picked apart in this policy. And we do need policies, right? So it kind of has to do its best, but that's a really glaring thing in there for me as well, because it's like no one's willing to talk about it.
Yeah, they see the damage that's being caused by a lack of thorough discussion of what consent is and what it means and how it can be applied in the real world. And yet when it breaks that kind of very narrow focus of what can we teach young people about what it means to engage in sex or sexual interaction with one another, it kind of falls apart. So like it's acknowledging cultural context, it's acknowledging LGBT plus context, and as you mentioned, Liz, there's a class context that isn't really quite acknowledged. But also it's like, well, there are young women engaging in the sex trade. We know this under the age of 18. We know this happens in youth, even though their narrow focus is, well, we're looking at youth, they're ignoring that glaring kind of.
And I think that they're ignoring it because they cannot square the circle. The two models are incompatible, and they're not trying.
Yeah, where it talks, the brief mention of porn, it only talks about it in terms of needing to help young people understand that porn is not instructional, and it should not essentially be teaching them how to navigate sex and consent. But that's actually kind of the less important point to be made about porn, right? Because actually it's, first of all, it does act as instructional to a lot of young people. We know this because of some of the trends emerging among the young people who have grown up on the internet consuming online pornography and stuff like that. But also, I think that the larger point about it is that this policy, one of the things that makes it really great is that it very clearly recognizes and enunciates the sort of underpinning societal attitudes that are behind this problem.
Yes.
And those attitudes are nowhere more clearly enunciated than in pornography.
In porn. Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, if we look at, if anyone wants a book to look at that is going to be helpful on this, highly recommend Gail Dine's Pornland. Don't read it on the train. Don't read it around small children, and do read it Bracing for Impact. But one of the things that she talks about is, the incredible rise in gonzo porn, and the fact that most of what is being looked for and consumed is inherently violent. It is about the degradation of women, about the pain of women. This is not the softcore porn magazines under the bed of 4 decades ago. Adults need to really understand I mean, I know some people who've grown up on porn are now adults, so I might be aging myself there. But, you know, people need to really understand the context of what is being seen in porn, and it is inherently the pain of women. This is not, you know, films of people having a mutual jolly time. You know, this is by definition the traumatization and assault of women. And so, yes, in context, porn is highly, highly relevant.
Yeah, so it ends up being kind of an oversight. And I do think that for a really great policy overall or framework, this is where it does actually fall short a bit, because when it comes to porn, I mean, it doesn't discuss the other parts of the sex trade at all, but when it comes to porn, insofar as it does mention it, it's basically just that doesn't count. Don't look at that. Listen to this instead. And that's really not enough, because they are listening to it.
Unless what they're doing is trying to tackle, you know, maybe there's some sneaky feminists here who are trying to tackle this thing and hoping to then expand the frame of reference to tackle other things which they do know to be problematic.
Well, yeah, I mean, possibly, because this is a difficult one, right? Whoever was involved in the development of this policy, that is not an easy thing to do. But I think ideally what would happen is there would be a much more proactive approach that invited, because again, remember, this is supposed to be guidance for, you know, like educators and stuff engaging with young people. It's not enough to say, oh, just like that doesn't count, don't worry about that. You want young people to critically engage with questions that relate back to this definition of consent. You know, like, when you're consuming online pornography, do you think that, you know, the woman in that scenario and the man, that any of the people involved, do you think that there is genuine mutual desire for that sexual activity? What about when that woman's being choked? What about when she's being spat on? You know, things like that. And that critical engagement with those questions is what probably has the best chance of actually tapping into that thing that's at the root of this problem, of the empathy and the compassion. That women are not made of rubber. Women are not objects. Women feel pain, and their pain matters, and you should care about their pain.
You have been listening to the Reclaim the Night Perth podcast. To catch future episodes or see what else we are doing, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or YouTube.